let's do this. So it is 6:02 on January 3rd, 2023. Happy New Year to all. And I will call us to order for the Community Development Committee. And we'll note the attendance of the council members, Councilmember Mayhew and Councilmember Lassay, myself, Councilmember Johnson, and the mayor is also present. For the agenda, unless there is any disagreements, we'll go ahead and adopt the agenda as presented. Okay. Then that takes us to public comments. And we do not have any members of the community here in the chambers, but let me check online. I do not see any other attendees. So that will take us to the minutes. And unless there are any amendments to the minutes, we will adopt the minutes as presented. Seeing none, we will adopt the minutes as presented. And that takes us to agenda bills. We have two before us. The first one is AB 23-004, the Department of Commerce Middle Housing Grant Agreement. Does Mr. Rogers or Ms. Arteche want to present what this is about? Great, thank you. Community Development Director Arteche.
Good evening, council members. My name is Emily Arteche. I'm the Community Development Director. And what you have before you this evening is essentially a grant that the city received to conduct middle housing, a study of middle housing. It also includes additional work such as a buildable lands analysis. This money is going to be used to help fulfill requirements that were passed through House Bill 1220 this past year. I think it's important to note that even though there's an associated contract with LDC to complete the work, this contract with LDC has no direct expenditures, no direct impact to the city's budget. And you may even notice that the Department of Commerce grant, which is attached as one of your exhibits, is a slightly higher dollar amount than the actual contract with LDC, and that would allow the city to actually document the time associated with managing the project on the city's end and to be reimbursed for that work.
Anything else?
No, happy to answer any questions.
So I just wanted clarification on the so-called cost. It says that the buildable lands analysis report, which is reimbursable with 112,500 grant monies, and the contract value is 94,200. Does that mean that the contract would be 94,000 some odd, and then that's just going to be reimbursed, or is the amount going to be the 112 plus the 94, and we're only going to get 112,000 back? I was just a little bit confused about what the numbers were saying.
Yeah, sure. Just to go over once again, the contract with the Department of Commerce is the grant money that we received. We asked for a slightly higher dollar amount than we contracted with LDC. So the LDC contract is lower at the $94,000 rate. The difference between what we're paying LDC and what we have contracted with Commerce is going to allow staff to track their time and be reimbursed for any project management and other work that we would do on our own without LDC.
The other thing that I just want to mention was that at one point, I can't find it right here, but in the agenda bill, it mentions that one of the things that is one of the requirements for just as a city must use, for missing middle housing, is to avoid a situation where you are essentially making people who are already in a low income situation, maybe they're not in the low income housing, but they just have a low income, are not displaced. There's kind of been a history in the last few decades where communities that just tend to be lower income happen to be the ones that are removed, displaced, that sort of thing. So I was just really happy to see that that's one of the things they considered.
That's a great observation, and I agree with you. This is a well sought out grant for the city. I think we can put it to good use. I think there's multiple opportunities to address lots of things, not just mental housing, but that displacement issue, which would be very hard for us to do on our own, had we not gotten grant money, and looking at other things too, like affordability and variety.
Yeah, variety is one of the key things that I'm certainly interested in. Other members of the committee have questions on this item? Yeah. So this would then be forwarded to council with the recommendation to approve and put it on consent? Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. And the next item is Agenda Bill 23005, which is a draft ordinance amending SMC chapters 14.3, 14.4, 17.35, and 17.8. Mr. Rogers.
Good evening. So thanks for reading it in a little bit, Chair. What you have is it's a somewhat lengthy ordinance, and this is kind of combining two. We took this to planning commission as two separate items. We're trying to combine it into one for the city council's purposes to make this a little more streamlined for you. This covers a fairly lengthy set of amendments, and so we're talking about two things here. We're talking about establishing a process that we call a site plan permit. That's a site plan reviewing process for all types of development projects, mostly on the commercial multifamily side. The city doesn't have a site plan permit process today. We have design review, we have building permits, we have various other types of review, but we don't have a singular permit process where we can kind of be the umbrella permit, if you will, for different types of development. We've seen this quite a bit in recent years when development projects, commercial ones come in, where we're issuing a separate building permit and doing separate civil reviews, for example, and there's nothing overarching kind of tying it all together for us. So this is a process improvement on our part. Now, associated with this, we're also including some amendments to the historic chapter. A lot of these stem from things the council has seen come through in the last couple of years. Some things we've identified with the process for doing historic design review. So some of what you're seeing is going to be an attempt to simplify things a bit by moving some reviews away from the historic design review and putting those on city staff, namely the community development director as the historic preservation officer. Signs is the prime example of that. Presently, signs in the historic district, so the downtown historic district, the Meadowbrook historic district, need to go through historic design review with the planning commission, sitting with the historic design review board. We'd be moving those to an administrative review. In addition, there's some other cleanups in the code that help make it a little more obvious what the process needs to be and where some of the thresholds are for what you're doing. If you're going to do an addition onto a building or do a new construction, that's going to remain a review for the historic design review board of the planning commission. We're also making the appeal procedures more clear. The committee members will recall, of course, the appeal of the project across the street that came through earlier in 2022. The idea here is to shift appeals, similar to how we do most land use appeals, to the city's hearing examiner. That will take them away from either the historic design review board being the appeal body for decisions of the historic preservation officer, and appeals of the board's decision should they be the initial decision maker, we now go to the hearing examiner as well to provide that outside legal land use professional review of decisions made for historic design review. The other major change that you will see in there, which is part of the reason why the ordinance is so lengthy, is presently the city's historic code references a number of sections of the King County. We're going to pull those out, or rather remove the references and then pull those provisions directly into Snoqualmie's code. So that's a huge chunk of the things you're seeing. The main reason for that is, quite frankly, to put our code in our own control. Right now, when we reference the King County code, King County Council are the keepers of that code. If they make a change, it automatically is incorporated by referencing our own code without this city council necessarily being able to look at that and decide, do we really want to do that? So this will make it, just put it under our control so that if there is a change, our own city council, you council members can review that, decide, do we want to do that? Do we want to do something different? What are the policy implications of this change? So right now, what you're seeing is just a straight copy paste from the elements of the King County Code straight into the Snoqualmie Code with no other things other than portion will say Snoqualmie instead of King County. So that's the high level view. Included in your agenda packet is the Planning Commission's recommendation on this, as well as a summary table of all the changes being made here. I'm certainly happy to take questions about this or discuss anything in detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Yes. Yes, President.
So I think, I've gone through it once and I sort of tagged my sure I have to go back and study more closely. But maybe you can kind of point me in the right direction. The thing that wasn't clear to me was, slowing back up, I think we're doing some really smart things here, moving a process that is intended to be somewhat objective, but is perceived, at least through our recent experience, is perceived by at least some people in the community as being not being objective, but rather being just subject to sort of just the council can just sort of legislate yes or no, when in fact that's not at all how that code works. So I think we're moving in a path to try and kind of get some of the misunderstood politics part out and get this, so we're shifting. If I understand it, it seems like we're shifting from something that might have been done by an appointed commission, shifting that to staff, and then shifting an appeal of that away from the city council to a hearing examiner. That may not be a correct understanding of what we're doing, but if it is, then the only concern I had was we went from 2 steps, both involving, if you will, elected or appointed bodies, to no elected body involvement at all. Now, is that just a misunderstanding of what's going on?
I would say somewhat. So what you're seeing, so today we have the city's code specified. Let's scroll it down to, and I'll put it on the screen here in a second. Hope this will actually work. Okay, and I know you can't read that, so let me zoom it in. So this is in the legislative formats, strike throughs for deletion, underline for addition. So the code today says that type 1 projects, are reviewed, decided by the historic preservation officer, meaning staff, the CD.
So that's currently the case.
Currently.
Got it.
So the routine maintenance one, the exterior painting, temporary signs, and then these 4 and 5, and I think let's go to the next page. Yes, all permanent signs. So 4 or 5, so routine maintenance for contributing buildings, additions to non-contributing building structures, and then permanent signs would now be added to that list of things that are reviewed and approved by the director.
And previously those things were
Reviewed and approved by the Historic Design Review Board.
got it. Thank you.
So then for the board, some of this is some adjustment. So this is, all this language here doesn't change. These are things that are reviewed by the board today, but still continue to be reviewed by the board. We shifted the demolition of, or rather we had a clarification for the demolition of non-contributing buildings or structures, or a significant portion thereof, because those by definition are not contributing to the historic district. They were built much later, things like that. We made the clarification that additions to contributing buildings or structures must be reviewed by the board, because of course additions to non-contributing buildings are not reviewed by the board. And then all new construction period at historic is going to be reviewed by the board, which is the same as today. And then this type 3 are also projects that are reviewed by the board. We mostly just cleaned this up. This is actually one very long run-on sentence. We put it in a nice list form and made it a little more clear. So that is the change. And then of course, appeals of these type 1s would go, decisions of the director are to the historic design review of the planning.
Mm-hmm.
And then appeals of these appeals are complicated under the current code. Appeals of type 2 projects that are within the landmark district, I should specify, go to the Snoqualmie Landmarks Commission, which is the King County Landmarks Commission with the addition of the Snoqualmie Historia. Historically, it's been Dave Batty, who now lives in the Unify area, no longer in the valley, unfortunately. We have not had cause to have to attempt to reappoint anybody to that commission for some time, so we're kind of leaving that issue aside for now. For those projects that are not within the landmark district, those appeals are to the city council. So the project across the street is the example there. Outside of the landmark district. What the streamline is all appeals of decisions of the Historic Design Review Board, whether the type 2 or type 3, are now going to the hearing examiner. There's no landmarks commission involved. There's no city council involved in that appeal process. To, as you try to make it more objective against the criteria in the code of the third-party land use professional.
Okay, I definitely understood everything you said about type 1. That seems sensible to me. So for the type 2, we've got some cleanup. Use that reference. So some cleanup, and then beyond the cleanup, just to make sure we're clear about this is what type 1 is, that's what type 2 is. So we try to clean that up. Type 1, we made some moves that we think are smart moves. Okay. For type 2, we're now saying today, type 2, if, let's see, the decision would always be made by who on type 2?
The board or the planning commission.
The planning commission would currently and would continue to make the initial type 2 decision.
Right.
The appeal would be different. The appeal currently goes one of two paths.
Right.
And now wouldn't go to either of those two paths. Instead, we go to the hearing examiner.
Correct.
Got it. Thank
And
you.
clarifying on that, type 2 would go to planning commission permanently, or is it historical planning commission acting as historical design report? So I want to make sure.
The latter.
Okay, I thought
The
so.
references are still to the historical design review board, which is the planning commission at the moment. And that I will admit is a separate issue, which could also be addressed, I think, separate from this particular ordinance in front of you. The council and the mayor wish to appoint the historical design review board as a separate entity. That's something we could certainly work through. The way the code is written is that the planning commission is effectively the interim historical design review board. But I don't want to confuse that.
We'll go back to council member Mayor and then.
Oh, sorry. Just could you, I was thinking a lot as I was reading through this about that, and the thought that was going through my mind is, gee, I wonder if they looked at just doing away with this historical design review board reference and just saying this goes to the planning commission. I'm guessing that that's probably a little more complex than that, but in any event, it doesn't look like they looked at that particular issue.
We have thought about that. Well, at the end of the day, it is a related but somewhat separate question for the council to consider, because the code for the lab, since this code was initially adopted 22 years ago, there has always been a reference to a historical design review board, and the council at the time, obviously, that was their intent of having this separate board. Whether we want to continue that is a question for the council.
Okay, but not being brought forward on this.
Correct. And the mayor, of course, in discussion.
Yeah, and just to be clear, in the entire 22 years, there actually never has been a separate historical designers review board, correct?
Correct.
Councilman.
I'm not so confused on that one because I'm used to seeing that in a lot of places. And it usually is just a matter of by reference, because some cities have historical design reviews, some don't. You just appoint the planning commission as the historic design review board and you move on. So my concern is similar to the first one brought up by Councilor Mayhew regarding the removal of anyone that's been elected from this process. The reason for that is City of Snoqualmie has a long and documented history of granting exceptions and deviations to the code. I wish it wasn't. However, if we're going to remove the council from that process, the planning, like the hearing examiner, is now making judgment calls on deviations and exceptions. If somebody says, "Well, I want to do this differently. I want to do landscaping differently than what's required. I want to do something that's different than that. And if it gets appealed, it never sees someone who's been elected to essentially defend the rights and obligations of the city of Snoqualmie by its citizens. I can't get behind that. I just can't. I think there's got to be some modification to have some level of elected involvement if there is a deviation or variation or exception or something that isn't strictly by the code. Hearing examiners are very good at following the letter of the code as it is written without modification. When you get them involved in judgment calls, they're not representative of our community. They aren't, and it gets to be messy. So as a committee, I don't know if that to me that means we need to think about what that is and provide some guidance, because it's not a matter of just saying that and walking away. It's a matter of let's figure out how that works into it. And granted, I didn't, it was a holiday. I didn't spend a whole lot of time going through it. I went through it once very quickly. And so I think that needs to be looked at, and we need to figure out how to address that, because I have some concern that essentially every single project that now comes through the city of Snoqualmie never sees someone who's been elected to represent it. And I think that has me some concern, because it's not, there are some simple projects. I'm not worried about those kind of things. It's when we get into the bigger projects and we get into projects that have a design review that might, want to ask for some exceptions. Now we're relying on a hearing examiner that doesn't have that background. So jump to my next question real quick. Site plan review. I'm glad to see that, because it's been an issue in the past. And actually, as an architect, I was working on a project with the city, and there wasn't no way to do a site plan review about 6 years ago, and ultimately led to we weren't sure what it was. Just kind of a no man's land of permitting. Ultimately, it got moved forward by somebody else, and it happened. But and I'll ask my question now. What are the plans for vesting in terms of code and approval with either building permitting or site plan review? Is that addressed in this packet? Because I didn't see anything in there.
Yeah, so vesting is not specifically addressed by this. Without Mr. Sturbeck here, it's a little bit difficult to give a more precise answer. Certainly, state law provides for vesting at the building permit stage and for preliminary plats or subdivision applications. And statutorily, at least, everything else is more on the table for vesting. That's the general answer. I would have to provide a detailed answer, unfortunately, that this does not address that, I would say.
And then I guess I wouldn't, if I rephrase my questions around, I would ask a question of what answer I want versus the answer that you may want to give. But I think what's important, I think, from a council perspective, at least one council member's perspective, is that site plan review doesn't circumvent any vesting of the project, that it becomes a trigger for SEPA or a trigger for land use or a trigger for establishing an overriding overall permit, but the vesting of a project, whether it hits a certain code milestone or if it grants rights to an applicant, is still building permit based.
Right, and I think, again, not being the city attorney, I don't think you would see an effect on vesting from this process, because it is not a building permit, it is not a subdivision application. There's two things that would statutorily vest you under state law. Certainly, there's some, I believe, relatively recent case law on the vesting issue, which and that case law involves specifically a development agreement, right? Which that's most of the time is involved. In more general terms, as staff, we're certainly aware of potential changes to the zoning code or development codes that are coming. We stay in communication with project applicants, say, hey, look, this is coming. The stormwater design manual, surface water design manual update last summer is an example of that, where we said, hey, look, people, this is coming. You need to be aware of it. Now, fortunately, the differences between the old manual and the new manual are not great for the vast majority of the project. of the environment. You're going to see a building code change come through later this spring, probably. That's an example of a more substantial one because of the complex building and building codes. So the communication issue is a big one that we try to stay in communication with all the applicants that they know what might change on them as they design their projects, work through the permitting process. So we try to avoid these becoming issues ahead of time. Which is not an ordinance code related answer. It's just how we try to do business. We have been fortunate to not get into an issue with this new year so far. I keep my fingers crossed on that.
You never know.
Yeah, exactly. You never know.
Anyway, that I guess I would suggest some feedback from Mr. Sturback on that. I would like to ensure those things are. Sure, Bob could clarify that, but that we're not treading into a situation that someone submits a site plan application or site plan review application, and all of a sudden it becomes vested in a certain code without code modifications and things like that. So. Pass on to the next one.
Councilmember Mayhew.
So, if you'd be patient with me, I just want to double back and just see if, based on your earlier answers, I've had a chance to think through a little further. So let me just review for a second. If we think about the type 1 projects, so those will be decided by planning director,
Correct.
and then appealable to hearing exam. Okay, got it. And then, so type 2 now. Type 2 decided by the planning commission, or sitting perhaps as the, okay. And appealable to a hearing examiner. Now, let me just think. So today, if there was an item that was appealable and appealed to the city council, is that a quasi judicial matter?
Yes, it is.
So the city council currently in that situation is not able to make a legislative decision. They have to make a quasi judicial decision, which has to do with, was there in essence, I know this is layman's term, but was there a mistake made by the planning commission? And in the absence of a mistake, then the appeal would be denied. Is that roughly a good description?
Yes, it is.
So the idea here is if all you're doing is looking to see if a mistake was made, that a hearing examiner perhaps is a better way to do that than asking council to do that. Possibly that would be the reasoning here. It's more, you got a professional that's better able to sort of lock in and make that decision. That's sort of the idea here.
Yes, that's the general idea.
Okay, that's helpful.
So I think to provide a little additional color, where the council typically is going to get involved in appeals are decisions of the examiner, where the examiner is the initial decision maker. So things like conditional use permits, variances are I think the two main examples where the hearing examiner makes that initial decision. And if somebody appeals it, then that goes to the city council for a quasi-judicial decision. The city council rather has seen that. There's an appeal of the conditional use permit for panorama apartments several years ago. There's an appeal of a denied conditional use permit to put a restaurant in the old bank across the street. I can't recall a variance that's even been submitted for so long recently. So it does happen. There are certainly things where the council is still going to see some land use appeals because that's the nature of how the process works. But there has absolutely been an effort, not just in this city, but I think statewide, to shift many of the quasi-judicial to shift a lot of quasi-judicial decision making away from the elected city councils for various reasons. One being that you as the city council have a wide array of duties. You know, you need to worry about budgeting, you need to worry about various policies affecting everything from personnel to utility systems to land use, and not solely focused on land use. You also, just by virtue of being an elected body, and I believe you recall this from some of the land use training we had last year, that you are an elected body, you are, for better or worse, you are politicians. You're concerned with that because that's how you get elected. That's what your role is. And these quasi-judicial proceedings aren't political at the end of the day. And so it is difficult, not impossible, certainly. City councils all the time do make these quasi-judicial decisions appropriately and well. This council did it with the Snoqualmie Mill PCI plan just recently, and with the same decision before that. So it's not that you can't do it, it's just difficult, it's time consuming, as you know. And the hearing examiner is trained, and they're impartial. They go through a whole thing talking about how they have more relationship other than the contractual with any of us, any property, and all those things. So the appearance of fairness is a big part of it, and just the flow of training is a big part of it. That's not to say that other considerations can't come into play, because you as the council do get to make a decision on how the appeal process works.
Yeah, so I understand that, Jason, when we're talking about land use decisions and big projects and developments and, you know, development agreements and all those things going on with that. We're talking about your individual projects now that aren't subject to those sorts of situations, and you're asking a hearing examiner to make a judgment call. And that's where I get concerned, because, you know, it may be a matter of, hey, I only want to provide a canopy over the entrance and not along the entire street, which isn't a land use decision that needs to go quasi judicial by any means. But how does a hearing examiner that, you know, make that choice, make that decision, when the community may be saying, hey, wait, you know, there's a reason why we have codes, there's a reason why we have zoning laws, there's a reason why we have form-based zoning in some areas, and those have been developed over time with care and consideration, and yet we often get applicants come in and say, I just don't want to do it. And there's no pushback. It's just like, oh, okay, you don't want to do it. Okay, we want your development, so we're going to let it happen. And then somebody's got to step in. And I think that's where council can be that the voice of reason. And it takes four. Let's be serious. I mean, it doesn't just take one person on the council saying, no, I don't like it. It takes four people saying that, and that's a significant decision. So I think that's where I get concerned about having a hearing examiner. If someone, you know, if someone comes in and says something that could be seen as superficial and not want to provide it, yet then it goes to a hearing examiner. How does the hearing examiner make that judgment call? And I think that's where it should be on the elected officials, that it should be on us. Because then if we make a bad decision, we feel it, we know it, you know, there will be ramifications to that within the community. And I think, you know, if a hearing examiner makes a decision on something that is unpopular, we've had no say in that. I think that creates quite an obstacle in my mind, at least. I'd like to find a way to find that compromise on this, where we're talking about simple decisions. We're talking about things that are very, very easy to do. I have no issue with hearing examiners. Our hearing examiners that we've had in the past have been fantastic. I'm not saying that they're not. And they've made decisions on things that were very well balanced, and they've been okay. But when it comes to judgment things, it's always been appealed back to council. So flipping that and having it be just planning commission, and you know, I'm thinking about type 2, type 3, not type 1, but being with the planning commission and then going straight to hearing examiner, not having that say. I would fear the number of, you know, requests for deviation from a standard would be, you know, significant, because there's no fallback. It's just it's a yes or no, and then you don't have judgment call from the elections. That's what I would.
So I'm just trying to think through what Councilor Rosé is talking about. Let me ask type 3. Who is the decider for type 3 projects, and where would those decisions be appealed?
So type 3 decisions are made by the Plan Commission, and the appeal today is to the Landmarks Commission, because by definition, the type 3 projects are going to be involving contributing buildings or landmarks, things like that. So the current code provides for the Landmarks Commission to get involved with those things. Ordinance would change that to the hearing examiner. type threes are split off, partly because of the contributing building issue, but also because if I scroll down here, there are. Yeah, there's not, we should make one because I did make one for some
We did
previous.
previously, that's right.
Yeah,
That's why.
and so it's a good suggestion. I will do that for, for the next meeting. There's some additional criteria for type 3 projects, which I've highlighted there, which is why they get split off relative to type 2 projects.
Okay, that's helpful. Let me tell you where I was going with that and see if this makes any sense. If you maybe go back to those type 2, 3. As I was listening to Councilmember Lasay's comments, what was going through my mind was, and I think he sort of alluded to this as well in his comments, is there are some decisions here that I think that what's being proposed sounds fantastic. Either a decision made by planning director or planning commission appealable to hearing examiner. There's a whole set of these either that I read or can think of that makes a ton of sense to me. Then there might be a few where I would want the appeal to go to the city, to continue to go or to go to the city council. But I think that would be somewhat limited. And so maybe it, and I guess I have a belief that there is a widespread concern on the council that with regard to a decision that was made by a planning director within the last couple of years, which fundamentally changed Center Street Boulevard. And it wasn't appealable, but there was just a lot of concern about that. So so I think there's sort of like this, I certainly have a hangover from that of just trying to make sure that a really big decision doesn't bypass the council. So most of those don't look like really big decisions. So what I'm thinking as I was listening to Councilman say is maybe I might reflect and sort of think about maybe there's only one or two things that are really big, and therefore maybe we call those out and give them the treatment that, still goes to the city council. And then the rest, we say, yeah, oh, actually, yeah, but this is smart with the rest of those. And maybe that's the way to finesse through this, to find those things that we agree with planning commission. Yeah, let's move this to that other structure, but maybe identifying the one or two things that perhaps we're worried about and fine, leave it something closer, something that's appealable to the city council for just that limited, targeted concern is maybe what I'm thinking.
I'm thinking, that's what I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to figure out what are those things in my head. And it always keeps going back to judgment calls. What are the judgment decisions that are non-quasi judicial, but not based in fact of the code, where someone asks for, like I said, a deviation or a variation or a modification of what they want to do. Say, hey, I really don't want to put windows on the north side of the building. Can I not do it? And it's not really a land use concern, but it's a, hey, that's actually looking at, that's looking right at a park or something, or it's got something that's there's some, and again, it's trying to come up with, I'm coming up with imaginary examples that I probably shouldn't, and should spend some more time going through it and try to think of what those things are where I'd be concerned. And just to clarify, we were talking about historic and landmark district projects in this modification. We're not talking about stuff on Center Boulevard or.
Right.
Yeah.
So slightly channeling Mr. Stewart for a moment, my generalized caution here is that land use approval processes are by definition quasi-judicial. And so to the extent there are what could be construed as judgment calls, they are judgment calls within the bounds of what's written in the code. So in a broader sense, that's where it becomes important for the council as the legislative body to set the codes ahead of time. I'm fond of telling anybody who will listen, oftentimes it's community members, but it's also project applicants, that if you are going to, by the time you get into the permitting process, it is too late. The codes are what they the codes are what they are, and there is nothing, the council can't change the codes by the of either just practical considerations or vesting, too late. And so you're stuck with what you have, for better or ill. Sometimes that results in less than optimum projects, sometimes it results in perfectly fine projects, but that is the nature of the process. And so to me, I think part of my answer, stepping, I think, back up to the 10,000 foot level is, to the extent we think there's issues with, too much wiggle room, too many apparently judgment calls in this code, we should aim to fix the code. Let's go search those out and say, look, do we want to have, are we leaving too much wiggle room? Do we provide for too much leeway here that the council doesn't want to provide for? Let's go address that. I think your example, Councilor, making about the Senate Boulevard issue is a good example of you've identified that. Fixing it is unfortunately more complicated than any of us hoped, but absolutely we're looking at what do we do about that, because it's clearly an issue. Anything in the historic code, while we're not looking at the substantive provisions of the design standards that are in here tonight, we remain open to taking a look at those and say, look, is something not working here? Are we getting what we want out of our historic design regulations? And part of the problem is when you don't have a chance to apply to the real projects, it can be difficult to identify, wait a minute, we get, if we say we're not ending up with what we want, let's go fix the code. And the council has tools in its arsenal, if you will, to address that. Moratorium is obviously it's a big tool, but the council could do that to say, stop, we're gonna fix it, we're gonna do a specific process and do that. Or you cannot do that, just go through the process anyway and try to fix it. And I don't say it's to try to, I'm not trying to say, no, don't do that.
Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
So let me give you an example. So I'm trying to stay away from the land use stuff. And it's really, your statement there was perfect, because it is really hard to give an example of something when you're trying to figure out. But I have an example when I was on planning commission, and I want to say this was probably 2016. The applicant wanted to build a building in the Meadowbrook corner there. And they wanted to add on to an existing building and then reclad it with the material. And it was going through planning commission, and we were talking about materialities and going through the code. And they had proposed to put a synthetic fiber cement siding on the building that had a texture to it to make it look like wood. And as we're going through the process, I brought up, well, the code specifically says those synthetic materials. Use natural wood or other products that are not synthetic. And we were clear in that, and the applicant kept saying, well, it'll look like wood. It'll look like wood. It'll look like wood. It'll last longer. It'll be more durable. It'll be, we won't have to stain it all the time. We won't have to replace it. We'll paint it less and all these sorts of things. So that's fine, but the code says it has to be a non-synthetic material. Under that situation, under the current code, if the applicant chose to appeal the decision, which they ended up not doing it and not moving forward with the change, they would have gone to city council, and council would have then been able to make a judgment call on whether that material change was whether that was, and it would have been the council's decision then within the community saying, yes, we've said this. Under this now, it would go to a hearing examiner. Well, I don't know. I don't know how a hearing examiner would make that decision, because the code is very clear in what it says. And if somebody says, well, I want to do something different, that has significant impact to the appearance and condition of our community. If they would have gone forward with that, it would have turned a brick building into a hardy clad building, which would not have been as nice. That was a pure judgment call. There was no real, it wasn't a zoning thing, it wasn't a land use issue, it wasn't quasi judicial. It was simply, that they wanted to use a certain material that wasn't allowed in the code. So I think those are the kind of things that I would put as an example of where I'd be concerned as a hearing examiner making a decision for a community that has an aesthetic, a purely aesthetic appeal. So anyway, I don't belabor that too much.
Yeah, so some of the items under the type 2 projects, it seems to me would be things that are not necessarily including deviations from the code, whether those are waivers or variances, and I can never keep straight which one's which, but that would not fall into those categories. But I wonder if really what we're looking at here with the concern are things that would include waivers or variances from the code. And if those would be items that we would want to be appealable to council instead of to a hearing examiner. So if there are no waivers or variances, you're just repainting the building within what's allowed in the color palette and the historic design code. It's like, okay, that's not asking for something that's not in the code. If you're asking for something that is not in the code, that would be something you would have to come to council on appeal. That seems about.
I think that's I think it's trying to find that where that line is crossed.
So then the question is that too wide of a net, right? If it's all waivers and all variances, is that too many things that don't need to come to us and should go to a hearing examiner? And like you said, I'm not sure where that line is, but perhaps it's a starting place.
Yeah, it's certainly a starting place. This chapter provides for variances specifically from the stands of this chapter. And so should an applicant ask for such a variance, so it's here,
Okay.
the board decides. And so we insert a provision, which is not there today, that says, look, if somebody asks for a type 1 application, that automatically gets bumped to a type 2 because they're asking for a variance, whether it's for different lighting on their sign. Like the variance thing.
Yeah.
So the board's going to decide that one. Staff's not going to take that one on because the body needs to look at that. I don't recall a variance from that David asked for a straight up variance from the historic design guidelines recently. Certainly, as I think the council knows, when you're looking at the design, you craft a code to try to get in this box, but there's a range of outcomes inside this box, and you don't necessarily want to make the box too small or too big. That's always that's the trick. And so to Councilmember Lasay's point about judgment calls, where a project falls within the box the city has constructed is to an extent a judgment call that does, as the board is reviewing the code, and does this project fit within the code as written? There is certainly some interpretation. Now we try to avoid that to an extent. I think you recall from the land use training, the Issaquah case about they just didn't like the design. We try to avoid things like that, but for obvious reasons. And that's what we continue to try to avoid as we go forward here. We don't want things to just be, I don't like that. That color is too. That's why we have a color palette. That way we can say, we say no neon colors, for example. Try to draw these bright lines. Don't do this. You can't do, and not just don't do this, but you can't do this. So if somebody comes in with a neon yellow trim color, we can say, no, you cannot do that. And the good news is, most projects are not going to be appealed. So,
Let's say if they had asked for a variance on that and the planning commission had said, yeah, we like the neon yellow, we're gonna give them that. And someone in the community says, no, we actually don't want that, we appeal that. And it goes to a hearing examiner who doesn't really know much about the look and feel of downtown Snoqualmie. They don't know how that might affect the character. So then having something like that be appealable to council, where we are here and we can look at the facts that are on the ground for how Snoqualmie looks and feels, then we can make a judgment call. And going back to a point that Councilman Mayhew had said, about how the idea on these quasi judicial matters, as I recall from the last time we went through something similar, was we're just looking for, did the planning commission make an error? Not do we just disagree with them, but did they make an error? And if they said that a variance was okay, and we think that it wasn't, then we would be saying, that they made an error by allowing the variance from what's in the code. Does that make sense?
And, oh, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, we had that issue, another, I won't mention the project because it's not fair to the project, the applicant situation, but we had that situation where it was granted as a variant, it's a modification to the requirements, and the hearing examiner did weigh in and say, yeah, that was an incorrect approval, and the council then, the council had to make this, the hearing examiner made it, no, it went through planning commission first. So when planning commission, hearing examiner was appeal, or was the decision maker, and then, I don't want to mention it because I don't want to give bad, saying bad, it was towards one instance, but anyway, the point being, yeah, I think I get what you're saying, but Jason, I didn't. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, so my thought on this is, I'm leaning heavily into what's being proposed here as being a really good idea. With this one sort of, if we will, narrow, I'll call it narrow carve out that I'm concerned about. So my thought is, I would like to see us just try to articulate what would be the narrow carve out. And then if we can identify that and then set something up for that that's different than what's that addresses this concern we've been kicking around, that maybe that would be an alternative that we would, so maybe we could go to full council saying, look, here's what planning commission recommended. In committee, we were concerned about this one thing. We only want to make this narrow proposal to modify it, and then the council could decide which way they want to go. Would that be a path that makes sense? But I guess the point here is, I think there's some work here to do. We would have to articulate what is this narrow concern that we're trying, I thought we got fairly far in it just now, but probably turning it into something, I think there's a little bit of work to do, and I don't know, maybe planning department can help us a bit, but there may be some work they have to do to actually articulate this. But maybe that would be,
I think it is around variances.
that's definitely where you're concerned.
The
with, your
aesthetic
comments.
character of the building and the overall, those sort of calls that don't really have community versus.
I feel like more personally that.
I think the three of us have a reasonably good understanding of what we're talking about. So I think that's what kind of committee job is. Let's clarify that so the council can then sort of say, okay, got it. You guys are giving this alternative, and then they can either decide, now we don't need that, or yeah, it's a good idea. Like they can then decide.
Okay, so it's the proposal then that you're giving us that we would forward this to council with a companion amendment, and we'd vote on the amendment as a council, and then on the main motion. Is that how you're thinking?
Sort of thinking that so that they can see what was recommended by planning commission. I think we should respect that the planning commission has made a proposal, and that the council should see that full recommendation, but then we could put this additional concern on to say, but here's the concern we had. Councilman decide whether they agree with this or not.
Yeah, but I would like more time to review through this because I still didn't have the time.
Yeah, I think we need that.
And then we can have it at the next meeting, craft that where it should be inserted, how it should be worded. Maybe Jason, you can relay this to the city attorney. Say this is what we're trying to do, and he can have some examples of maybe just other codes that provide some guidance and start talking about.
the flow chart permits.
The flow chart, so the type 1, 2, 3. So I know you had it for all the type 1, 2, 3, 4
Yeah,
type
yeah, for
projects.
the,
So
yeah, I can,
it was different. It was different table, but something similar to this.
Yes, ma'am.
So isn't the chart that's included in it, that it also includes the types? It shows permits, but then also included in the wording, it shows the types. And so it does show what the approval process is goes through. Right there.
It does, Mayor. This is the, if you look at general permit categories, and so this applies to all the permits, not just the historic ones. And so I think
It has a historic design review type 1, for instance, in there.
it does, and that's an addition. I think for what I think is for clarity, I would generate one that's specific to just the historic design review types and leave off the other things so that we can show the council with more clarity. Here's what the current process is for type 1, that's this and this and this, and here's the process for type 2 currently this and then show. And here's the proposal to change it, and also, of course, draw in what the committee is discussing here tonight, just for clarity's sake.
Redevelopment Director Arteche.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I'd like to just demonstrate that having the permit types and the process for decision-making in one table is a huge immense benefit to any jurisdiction. This is something that, in my opinion, has been missing for quite some time in Snoqualmie. So the more that we articulate other tables that are different than this main table, the more difficult it becomes to kind of discern what the decision-making process is. That being said, I'm wondering what the thoughts are if staff could go back and take a look at that particular section that dealt with variances and modifications and articulate some information there that may be amenable to address the discussion that we've had tonight. And then we could take that and then reflect any necessary changes in this existing permit table that the Planning Commission has already reviewed.
Yeah, I think that's effectively what we're asking.
That's
Okay.
basically what it
Okay, thank you.
That'd be great.
Mr. Survey's reporting next week as well, so. It's gonna put their questions.
is. Smells really good right now. So don't.
Right. There was one other thing that I just want to mention because just from my experience when I was on the Planning Commission, and that was with regard to the permanent signs. It's definitely a point of tension for me because the signs can be a frustrating thing that can take up a lot of time, and there could be a lot of them when the Planning Commission perhaps has more important things they can work on. There were a couple of times where the Planning Commission made recommendations that, in my opinion, did improve the sign that was proposed during my time there. So it's definitely a struggle. I think that in the end, I'm comfortable with where the Planning Commission and staff have landed. But anyway, it's just the way that it is. It's got to go one way or the other.
And I would just say this is a classic case of the council's policymakers you get to decide what you think ultimately is the best approach here. We will certainly recommend something to you. You can see it on the screen. But if the council believes that the board should continue to permit signs, that's okay. That is your call to make collectively.
Yeah, I think that what I'm trying to say very poorly here is that, well, I do think that our recommendations did improve those signs when they came forward. And almost always we just approved the signs as they came to us because they fit the code. And that's what we do, right? We look, what's the code say? Does the sign match the code? Yes, it does. Great. And then we sometimes just add in, hey, do you think you could do this? I don't think that those changes and those improvements were worth the significant amount of time that the Planning Commission put into sign review. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, and why I think I would land on the side of being okay with staff reviewing them. But I did just want to voice that from my experience. Okay. Any other thoughts on this item for tonight? I think we have homework. It's kind of on us to think about what are the exceptions to these different items that we think should come back to council if it's appealed, and then for staff to come up with that table that we discussed, and perhaps to maybe we should have, if possible, Mr. Sturbank here next time. That'd be appropriate.
Yes, and you certainly heard from the director. We've heard your discussion tonight too. Of course, we will come back in a little over 2 weeks actually,
Yeah.
as a holiday, with some, hopefully some language added into this that we're going to try to capture with your discussion. So you're not just working for nothing.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, our next meeting is
We do have a city attorney online,
Oh,
And
is he here?
and she helped with the.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Thank you.
She had specific questions regarding that.
Also, I did want to note the attendance of Councilmember Christensen, who you have left by now, but was here for quite some time. So just let the minutes reflect. Councilmember Christensen is here. Do we have any questions right off for sorry, Ms. Astrachan? I don't think so at the moment.
so. Unless you can come up with the top, from the top of your head
Right.
examples. It's sort of language. I
Right.
think it's something that's right.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, then if we are satisfied for the time being, then we'll go ahead and move on, which I believe brings us to the end of our agenda for tonight. So unless there's any further business or objection, we will consider ourselves adjourned. Okay, 7:05 PM.